What about you, Annie? How do you feel about it? Because I know you sometimes like to get your motivation from other unworldly chemical reactions. And so sometimes you might actually open a third eye that perhaps Coco and I don't utilize quite as much. What does your third eye tell you?
Ooh, that's something that I don't feel I'm ready for. I. But I
You're
am
not there yet.
I'm kind of along the same lines as Stephen Hawking. He was kind of along the lines of aliens being hostile and conquerors of whatever they can touch or reach. And I question the same things. What are the aliens' intentions? What do they look like? What are their capabilities?
You think that because I mean Stephen Hawking didn't really mention the existence of aliens. He just mentioned the sort of the groundbreaking discovery that we found out in regards to the universe, but he didn't really talk much about aliens. You don't have any like particular views that you're comfortable sharing in regards to their existence, their abilities, how many cells they have, their structure, stuff like that.
I mean, Area 51 and it being a focal point for aliens and aliens themselves have got to be like some of my favorite conspiracy theories. I honestly can't pick a side if like they're real or not until I actually experience them myself. But I would think they're pretty much along the lines of being like us, having internal organs and being able to bleed.
So they're more humanoid than anything else, correct? Like they interact with matter the same way that we would. In your opinion, like you think that's how they would be.
Yeah, I mean they could even way ahead of us and develop like some type of exoskeleton, like in that movie Battle Los Angeles, where they've covered up all their vulnerabilities and just evolved past that. So they have permanent armor where we're just exposed.
It's interesting you would mention that because over recent years, not just with games but with movies, they sort of had all these different theories about extraterrestrial life forms, and it gets you thinking like, why the huge interest in that specific field? You know what I mean? Like, what's really going on behind the scenes there?
Yeah, like any conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and certain conspiracy theories that I feel like are a lot more popular than others are not being mentioned in the same way, right? Or maybe they're subtly hinted at, like with Aliens versus Predator, for example, with like the aliens sort of looking like lizards, right? And there's been mention of them existing among us, these lizard people. And that's always been one of the more interesting ones that I've never really quite understood or figured out. Like, what is the story behind lizard people? Can you guys help me figure it out? Like, what is the story behind that conspiracy that there are aliens among us that exist as lizards or amphibians or something like that? Like cold-blooded creatures that are humanoid and think and interact the same way as us.
I actually saw some of that, actually, now that you mention it. The thing about lizard people is that they say that they like shifters and they could change. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories of them, and like celebrities is mostly them. Yeah, like if you look through YouTube, you could find clips of like certain celebrities' eyes changing lizard-like. For a few people go crazy about that.
That's funny. That's funny because if like now that you mention that, because I used to live in California and that's when I met Annie. Now that you mentioned that, Coco, I did notice there are certain people. I always thought that maybe it's because because how it is with California. Like once you get into certain types of drugs, it sort of changes your physical format. You look a lot different. So I always assumed that the way their appearance changed had something to do with sort of their interaction with the drugs that they're taking on a regular basis. But I do remember seeing quite a few people in just like that off-putting physical form that in my head I always try to find logic deriving it from drugs and substances that could tweak you to the point where you would look like that. Like your pupils would be super dilated, and their necks sometimes felt like there was like a frog living inside their neck, and it looked like it would just sort of expand and then contract and expand and contract. I've seen some shady stuff when I was in California, so I know where you're coming from with that. But I'm also assuming that it could have something to do with the substances that are being sold in California, because nowadays you get all sort of crazy shit. Like you know what I'm talking about, Annie. You could relate.
Definitely. This is kind of an interesting one because my brother's really into. He calls them reptilians.
Yeah, that's what I've heard them being called. Exactly. And like I said, I've seen people that look like that, but they were always super into drugs. Like, and at some point, a lot of them were sort of like in my inner circle, right? Because I was living with a group of people, and during my time with them, I noticed that, they act different as well. But again, I always related that to drugs. I never considered that, it's something that's a lot more diabolical than that, which is interesting. Like, now that I look at it from that perspective, I always felt like they were odd as compared to anybody else that I met, really. And so, there are many different ways that you could view this, though, right? Because the millennials would perhaps consider that conspiracy theory to be the truth about, those type of people. But if you were to discuss this with religious people, people that read scripture, whether, biblical scripture or the Quran or the Torah for the Jews, what's commonly mentioned in those scriptures are, the other life form aside from humans, the demons or the devils, right? And so, like, when you see people like that, you assume that they're possessed. If you're coming from a religious background, you would assume that, they're possessed by Satan or like a demonic force. While others who are not quite as familiar with the scripture would assume that they're aliens. So there are plenty of different ways of looking at it, but it's like, regardless of the way you look at it, you have to admit, sometimes you feel like there's a lot more going on than just your own thoughts or your own domain. You know what I mean? Your own physical space. There's a lot more going on than your own physical space, right? Like, you would sometimes feel like you got cold all of a sudden, even though it's in the middle of summer. Or you feel like you heard scratches or whispers. There's some odd paranormal activity going on around you that you can't really explain. And so you would feel like the presence of something else going on around you. You could contribute that to the existence of extraterrestrials or the existence of something else, a form of energy that you cannot quite see. Have you guys ever experienced that? Have you guys ever seen or felt anything like that? And how far has it gone with you guys? I'm more interested in Annie's stories, because I know Annie has had, quite the adventurous lifestyle since she's been in California a lot more than I have. And so I feel like she would understand, or she would have probably heard something by now. Is that the case, Annie?
I actually have family that have been stationed at Naval Air Force bases that have some crazy experiences and stories that they've told me.
Interesting. Anything you would like to share?
So, they were, my uncle says that it was about midnight and alarms started to go off about something flying overhead. So they scrambled the jets. And apparently after the pilots came back, they were talking about how they were chasing a sphere-shaped object that was super fast. They couldn't keep up with it. Pilots were all freaking out. Hardly any of them could speak, and you could see video footage. I didn't get to see it personally, but my uncle did. And this thing was pulling maneuvers that they had never seen before, jamming their instruments, and just had them all shooken. It got to the point where they all had to be relocated.
That is so strange. You're saying it was a flying saucer that was caught on camera?
A sphere-shaped object. They didn't say flying saucer. They said it was just round, just an orb.
Huh. Interesting. And it didn't. It just like jammed their signals. It didn't approach them. It didn't try to harm anyone or hurt anyone. It was just messing with them.
Yeah, it just triggered the alarms. 15 minutes later, after chasing it around, the pilots came back, and like I said, they're all freaked out.
That is, wow. That is quite odd. And so, did anyone manage to get the footage? Like, is it somewhere out there? What happened to the footage?
That's, I think it's all Navy property now.
It'd be impossible to get your hands on that, huh? I would have loved to see.
Yeah, that's... Me too. He said that on the last few seconds of the video, the sphere just shoots up straight into the sky, and that's why they stopped chasing it.
Wow.
It just goes completely vertical.